You know that moment when a name just won't come. It's right there. You can almost feel it, and then it slips away. Or you walk into a room and stand there, completely blank, wondering what you came for. Most of us brush it off, but somewhere in the back of your mind, a quieter question starts forming. Is this the beginning of something worse? I hear that fear every week in my neurology clinic, and for a long time, the standard answer was simple. It's just aging. Your brain is getting older. It happens to everyone. That answer has been wrong for a long time. What the research now shows, clearly, consistently, is that the fog you're noticing is not a clock problem. It's a chemistry problem. And in the next several minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what that chemistry is, where it starts, and what you can actually do to change it. Here is something I want you to sit with for a moment. Two people, both 72 years old. Same neighborhood, similar lives. One of them is sharp, reading, learning new things, holding conversations with ease. The other is struggling to follow a story, losing words mid-sentence, feeling like there's a fog that never fully lifts. Same age, completely different brains. If cognitive decline were simply a feature of getting older, that difference wouldn't exist. But it does, and I see it constantly. The variable isn't age. It isn't even genetics most of the time. It's metabolic history. What has been happening inside the body, quietly, for years. This is not just aging, it is biology. Now, the brain has a remarkable ability to keep functioning even when things go wrong. We call this cognitive reserve. Think of it as the brain's backup system. It finds alternate routes, compensates, adapts. But that reserve isn't unlimited. It gets worn down. And one of the most consistent things I see eroding it, in patient after patient, is a process driven by chronically high blood sugar. Here's where I want to introduce something that sounds almost too simple to be serious. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Something chemically similar to caramelization happens inside your body when blood sugar stays elevated for years. Sugar molecules attach themselves to proteins and fats, including in your brain, and when they bond, they form what researchers call advanced glycation end products. AGEs. They age tissue. They make things stiff and sticky that should be flexible. They trigger inflammation. They interfere with how cells communicate. And they accumulate slowly, over years, without ever announcing themselves. Most people eating what they believe is a reasonable diet, a little sweetened yogurt, some juice, bread with most meals, an occasional dessert, are still producing enough of a chronic glucose load to keep this process running in the background. Not dramatically, not dangerously in the short term, just steadily. But first, I need to show you how sugar gets into the brain in the first place, and why the delivery system itself eventually breaks down. Most people think of insulin as a blood sugar tool. Your pancreas releases it after a meal. It shuttles glucose into your cells, and the system resets. That's the version most of us learned. But here's what that version leaves out. Your brain has insulin receptors too. Quite a lot of them actually, concentrated in the very regions responsible for memory and learning. And insulin in the brain doesn't just manage energy. It supports how neurons communicate, how memories get consolidated, and how synapses stay healthy enough to do their job. Insulin, in the brain, is not optional background machinery. It is central to how you think. So here is the problem. When you eat a high-sugar diet over months and years, your cells get flooded with insulin so often that they start to tune it out. The receptors downregulate. The signal gets weaker. And eventually, the brain's cells stop responding properly, even when insulin is present. Think of it this way. Insulin is a key, and glucose is the fuel waiting outside the door. In a healthy brain, the key turns smoothly and the fuel gets in. But when insulin resistance develops, the lock starts to jam. The brain is surrounded by energy it cannot access. This is why some researchers have begun calling Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes. I want to be careful here. That framing is still debated, and I am not saying sugar causes Alzheimer's directly. What the research does show, clearly and consistently, is that insulin resistance in the brain is a significant, measurable risk factor for the kind of neurodegeneration we see in Alzheimer's. The impaired glucose metabolism, the disrupted signaling, the accumulation of toxic proteins. These processes connect metabolic health to brain health in ways that standard checkups almost never address. And that last part is what I find most troubling in my clinic. I sat with a woman not long ago, late 60s, active, no diabetes diagnosis, blood pressure well controlled. By every standard metric her doctor had run, she was fine. But she'd been noticing for 2 years that her memory felt unreliable. Words slipped. She'd reread the same paragraph without it sticking. She chalked it up to stress, then to age. What her standard panel had never included was a fasting insulin test. When we ran it, her insulin was chronically elevated, a clear sign her cells had been resisting its signal for some time. Her fasting glucose looked acceptable because her pancreas was still working hard enough to keep it there. But the compensation had a cost, and her brain was paying it. This is the trap that catches so many people. Fasting glucose and even HbA1c can look reasonable while fasting insulin is quietly elevated, while the brain's fuel delivery system is already under strain. The standard panel measures the symptom being managed, not the mechanism doing the damage. Now there's a second pathway that makes this worse, and it operates at night, while you sleep. But first, I need to show you exactly which part of the brain bears the heaviest load from all of this, and why losing it early is what produces the specific symptoms you're most afraid of. Let me introduce you to the hippocampus. It sits deep in the temporal lobe, one on each side of your brain, curved like a small seahorse. And its job, put simply, is to act as your brain's filing clerk. Every new experience you have, a conversation, a face, where you parked the car, what you were just about to say, passes through the hippocampus before it gets stored as a long-term memory. Without it working properly, new information doesn't stick. It's not that the memory was made and then forgotten. It's that it was never fully filed in the first place. This is why hippocampal damage produces the specific symptoms most people describe when they talk about memory fear. Not the loss of old memories, those tend to stay intact longer. It's the new ones that slip. The name of someone you just met. The errand you meant to run. The word that was right there a moment ago. Now here is what makes the hippocampus uniquely vulnerable to everything we've been discussing. It has the highest concentration of insulin receptors in the entire brain, which means it is the most dependent on healthy insulin signaling and the most exposed when that signaling breaks down. When insulin resistance takes hold, the hippocampus feels it first and feels it hardest. But that's only part of the story. Remember the AGEs we talked about earlier, those sticky compounds that form when sugar bonds to proteins over time. In the hippocampus, AGEs do several things that are worth understanding. They cross-link with the proteins that keep blood vessel walls flexible, so the small vessels feeding this region grow stiff and narrow. Blood flow drops. The tissue gets less oxygen, less glucose, less of everything it needs to function. At the same time, AGEs suppress something called BDNF, Brain-Derived Neurotrophic Factor. Think of BDNF as fertilizer for neurons. It supports the growth of new connections, helps existing synapses stay strong, and plays a direct role in the hippocampus's ability to generate new cells. When AGE accumulation pulls BDNF down, the hippocampus starts to shrink. Not suddenly, not dramatically in any given month, but measurably over years. Brain imaging research has made this visible. In people with insulin resistance, PET scans show reduced glucose uptake in the hippocampus and the surrounding medial temporal lobe. The region literally appears to go quieter on the scan, using less fuel, processing less efficiently. This isn't a theoretical risk. It is a pattern researchers can observe and measure before a person has received any cognitive diagnosis at all. And then there is the night shift problem. While you sleep, your brain runs a waste clearance operation, a network of channels called the glymphatic system that opens up during deep sleep and flushes out the toxic proteins that build up during the day. Think of it as a cleaning crew that can only work when the building is empty. When blood sugar is chronically elevated, the crew can't finish the job. Waste accumulates in the very regions already under the most metabolic stress. Here is the part I want you to hold on to. The hippocampus is one of the only regions in the adult brain capable of generating new neurons. That capacity doesn't disappear with age, but it does respond, for better or worse, to the biological conditions around it. Which brings us to what those conditions actually look like in daily life. So what does this actually look like in daily life? Not on a brain scan, not in a research paper. In your own experience, on an ordinary Tuesday. The early signs are easy to dismiss, and that is exactly why they get dismissed. Word-finding difficulty is usually first. You're mid-sentence, and the word just isn't there. Not an unusual word, a common one. And it comes back a few seconds later, or a minute later, but the pause was long enough to notice. Then there's losing the thread. You're telling a story, or following one, and somewhere in the middle you realize you've lost the point entirely. You were just there, now you're not. Walking into a room and forgetting why is almost universal, but the frequency matters. Once in a while is normal. Several times a day, about different things, starts to mean something else. And then there's the new learning problem. You read something, or someone tells you something, and it simply doesn't stick. You're left with the vague impression that information passed through, but nothing solid remained. I want to draw a careful line here, because not everything is cause for alarm. Normal aging does slow things down. Processing speed, how quickly you take in and respond to information, does decline modestly over the decades. That is real, and it is normal. But what normal aging does not do is create gaps. It does not produce fog. It does not cause inconsistency, where you're sharp one morning and struggling that same afternoon. That inconsistency in particular is a metabolic fingerprint. The brain running on unstable glucose is like a lamp on flickering power. The problem isn't the bulb, it's the current. I worked with a retired professor who came to see me about 18 months ago. Brilliant man, still reading widely, still curious. But he'd noticed something troubling. He was rereading the same paragraph over and over, and it wasn't sticking. He'd assumed his concentration was slipping. Maybe fatigue. Maybe just the territory of being in his mid-70s. What we found was that his fasting insulin had been elevated for years, undetected, because no one had run the test. His standard blood work was unremarkable. but the fuel delivery to his hippocampus had been compromised for long enough that new learning had become genuinely difficult. Not impossible, not permanent, but real. This is the piece I most want you to take away from this section. If you are experiencing this kind of cognitive fog, the question worth asking is not, is this normal aging? The better question is, has anyone measured your metabolic environment? Fasting insulin, not just fasting glucose, tells a different story. HbA1c gives you a picture of your average glucose load over 3 months. A simple dietary pattern review can reveal a chronic sugar burden that no symptom checklist would catch. Most standard checkups do not include fasting insulin. You may need to ask for it specifically. And having that number, along with your HbA1c, gives you and your doctor something real to work with. Not just a reassurance, but a map. This is not about fear. It is about information. And having this information puts you well ahead of where most people are when they finally start asking the right questions. Now here is where hope enters this story. And I mean that in a biological sense, not a motivational one. The same mechanisms that explain the damage also point directly to what reverses it. The brain is remarkably resilient. Neuroplasticity is real. And the hippocampus, that small, curved filing clerk we've been talking about, is one of the few regions in the adult brain that can generate new cells, grow new connections, and recover function when the conditions around it improve. What we need to do is restore those conditions. Think of this less as a diet plan and more as a biological recalibration. The first lever is reducing the glucose load. Not eliminating carbohydrates. That is not what the evidence supports for most people. What it supports is flattening the spikes. Chronically high glucose is what drives glycation and insulin resistance. Occasional glucose is what the brain was designed to handle. In practical terms, this means eating fiber before starch. Vegetables, legumes, or a handful of nuts before a carbohydrate-heavy portion significantly slows glucose absorption and flattens the insulin response. Protein with every meal does the same. And it means eliminating liquid sugar, juice, sweetened drinks, even things marketed as healthy, because liquid glucose enters the bloodstream fast, with nothing to slow it down. Flatten the spikes consistently, and insulin levels drop. The locks begin to turn again. The second lever is movement. Aerobic exercise is the most powerful known stimulator of BDNF, that fertilizer for neurons we discussed earlier. When you walk briskly, swim, or cycle, your muscles produce compounds that cross into the brain and directly support hippocampal cell growth. Exercise also improves insulin sensitivity in the brain itself, independent of weight loss. 30 minutes of sustained aerobic activity changes the chemistry. Not over months, within days of starting a consistent habit, the biological environment begins to shift. The third lever is protecting the night shift. The glymphatic system does its deepest work during slow-wave sleep, and it's fragile. Short sleep, alcohol, or late-night sugar all disrupt the deep stages that matter most. Consistent sleep timing, a cool, dark room, and avoiding sugar or alcohol in the 2 hours before bed, these are not minor lifestyle adjustments. They are the difference between a maintenance window that runs fully and one that doesn't. There is one more thing worth mentioning, and I raise it not as a prescription, but as context. When glucose pathways are impaired, the brain has a workaround. It can run on ketones, a fuel source produced when carbohydrate intake is low and fat metabolism increases. Some researchers are now exploring this pathway in people with early cognitive decline, precisely because it bypasses the broken insulin receptor and delivers energy directly to neurons that are struggling. This is not a cure, and it is not right for everyone. But if you are working with a doctor on cognitive concerns, it is a conversation worth having. But here is the thing I have to be honest with you about. In my clinic, I have watched people do almost everything right. Better sleep, daily walks, cleaner meals, and still lose ground. And when we looked carefully at what was happening, it almost always came back to one specific daily habit. Something they were eating regularly, often in the morning, that they believed was the healthy choice. It was quietly driving the very process we just spent this entire video discussing, undoing everything else they were working toward. There was a woman I saw not long ago, 64 years old. She had never been diagnosed with diabetes. She exercised. She read labels. By most measures, she was doing the right things. But she came to me with early dementia, and when we traced it back, one particular food she had been eating every single day for years was accelerating the damage faster than anything else in her life. Her story is in the next video, right here. And I don't say this lightly. If you care about protecting what you've just learned today, you need to watch it. Because the changes you make this week can be undermined quietly, without you ever realizing it, by something still sitting in your kitchen. Knowing what it is doesn't take long, but not knowing it is a risk I wouldn't want you to carry. It's right there. Watch it now.